When Rebecca Collins received that devastating text message on a Tuesday morning in September, she never imagined it would become the catalyst for the most transformative period of her life. The message was brief, cold, and surgical in its cruelty. "I can't do this anymore. I'm leaving. James will pick up my things." 47 years old, with 23 years of marriage behind her, Rebecca stood in her suburban Chicago kitchen, staring at the screen of her phone as if the words might somehow rearrange themselves into something less devastating. The coffee maker gurgled behind her, filling the silence that suddenly felt deafening in their empty house. "Hello, my dear friends. This is Tina, and I'm here with you today as someone who understands that life sometimes throws us curveballs that completely change our direction. Today, I want to share Rebecca's story with you, a woman who discovered that sometimes the worst thing that happens to us can become the very thing that sets us free. This isn't just a story about betrayal or abandonment. It's about discovering who you really are when everything you thought you knew about yourself gets stripped away. I promise you that by the end of this story, you'll see how Rebecca transformed her deepest pain into her greatest triumph. If you're going through a difficult time right now, or if you know someone who is, please stay with me until the very end, because Rebecca's journey will show you that it's never too late to start over and build something beautiful from the ashes of what was lost. And if this story touches your heart, please give it a like and subscribe to join our family of people who believe in second chances and new beginnings. Rebecca had met David when she was 24, fresh out of college with a degree in elementary education and dreams of making a difference in children's lives. He was 30, confident, and established in his accounting firm. She fell in love with his stability, his certainty about the future, and the way he seemed to have all the answers when she felt lost in the overwhelming possibilities of adulthood. David had a plan for everything. They would marry within 2 years, buy a house in the suburbs, have 2 children, and build a comfortable middle-class life. Rebecca, who had grown up in chaos with parents who divorced when she was 12, found his predictability reassuring. She wanted security, wanted to belong somewhere, wanted to build the stable family she had never experienced as a child. For the first 10 years, the plan worked beautifully. They bought a 4-bedroom colonial in Oak Park with a white picket fence and a garden where Rebecca could plant roses. She taught 3rd grade at the local elementary school, coming home each day with stories about her students that made David smile over dinner. They tried for children for 3 years before the doctors gently explained that it wasn't going to happen naturally. The fertility treatments were expensive, emotionally draining, and ultimately unsuccessful. Rebecca threw herself into her teaching with renewed passion, treating her students like the children she would never have. David threw himself into his work, climbing the corporate ladder with methodical determination. But somewhere around their 15th anniversary, something shifted. David began working later, traveling more for conferences, and when he was home, he seemed restless, constantly scrolling through his phone or talking about colleagues Rebecca had never met. She noticed him at the gym more often, updating his wardrobe, paying attention to his appearance in ways he hadn't since their early dating days. When Rebecca mentioned feeling disconnected from him, he brushed off her concerns with practiced efficiency. "You're being oversensitive, Becca. I'm just focused on advancing my career so we can have the security we've always wanted." She wanted to believe him, needed to believe him, because the alternative was too frightening to consider. The signs became harder to ignore as months passed. There were unexplained charges on their credit card statements, mysterious phone calls that ended abruptly when she entered the room, and a distance in his eyes that made her feel like she was living with a stranger. Rebecca found herself walking on eggshells, trying to be the perfect wife, cooking his favorite meals, keeping the house immaculate, and avoiding any topics that might cause conflict. She began questioning everything about herself. Was she too boring, too predictable, too old-fashioned? At 47, she caught herself studying her reflection with harsh criticism, noticing every line around her eyes, every gray hair, every sign that time was passing. The morning she received that text message, David had left for what he claimed was a business trip to Atlanta. Rebecca had kissed him goodbye at the door, told him she loved him, and reminded him to call when he landed safely. 6 hours later, her world imploded with the ping of her phone. She called him immediately, her hands shaking as she dialed, but it went straight to voicemail. She tried again and again until she realized he had blocked her number. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. 23 years of marriage, and he couldn't even face her to end it. Later that evening, James, David's younger brother, arrived at her door with the awkward duty of collecting David's belongings. He couldn't meet her eyes as I. He mumbled apologies and loaded suitcases into his truck. The first week after David left passed in a blur of disbelief and practical necessities that Rebecca had never imagined she would have to handle alone. She called in sick to work, spending her days moving through the house like a ghost, touching objects that suddenly felt foreign and meaningless. The coffee maker that had gurgled cheerfully every morning for 15 years now seemed to mock her with its routine efficiency. The dining room table where they had shared thousands of meals together felt enormous and empty, even when she tried to eat standing at the kitchen counter instead. Sleep became elusive, and when it finally came, she would wake up reaching for David's familiar warmth, only to find cold sheets and the devastating reality that he was truly gone. Rebecca's sister Jennifer drove up from Springfield the moment she heard the news, arriving with grocery bags full of comfort food and a fierce determination to help her sister through the crisis. Jennifer had never particularly liked David, often commenting privately that he was too controlling and dismissive of Rebecca's opinions, but she had kept her concerns to herself out of respect for her sister's choices. Now, sitting in Rebecca's living room with a cup of tea growing cold between her hands, Jennifer felt both heartbroken for her sister and quietly vindicated in her long-held suspicions about David's character. "I know this feels like the end of the world right now, but honey, maybe this is actually the beginning of something better," she said gently, though Rebecca couldn't imagine anything good emerging from such devastation. It was Jennifer who insisted they drive past David's office building on Friday afternoon, not to confront him, but to get a glimpse of the woman who had stolen her sister's husband. Rebecca protested weakly, claiming she didn't want to know, but deep down, she needed to see her replacement, needed to understand what she lacked that another woman could provide. They sat in Jennifer's car across the street, and at exactly 5:15, David emerged from the building with a woman who looked to be in her early 30s. She had glossy blonde hair, wore a tailored business suit, and moved with the confident stride of someone who had never doubted her place in the world. Rebecca watched David open the car door for this stranger with the same gallant gesture he had once reserved for her, and something inside her chest cracked open with a pain so intense she could barely breathe. The divorce proceedings began immediately, with David's lawyer making it clear that he wanted a quick, clean separation with minimal financial entanglement. After 23 years of marriage, Rebecca was entitled to half of their assets, but the house would need to be sold, and she would have to find a new place to live. The prospect of apartment hunting at 47, after decades of home ownership, felt overwhelming and humiliating. David had apparently been planning his exit strategy for months, transferring money to accounts Rebecca didn't know existed, and consulting with attorneys while still sharing her bed. The calculated nature of his betrayal was perhaps more devastating than the infidelity itself. This wasn't a moment of weakness or a midlife crisis. It was a methodical dismantling of their life together, while he smiled at her across the breakfast table each morning. Rebecca's colleagues at school rallied around her with the fierce protectiveness that educators show when one of their own is hurting. Principal Martinez insisted she take additional personal days, and her teaching partner Sarah brought her homemade soup and refused to accept any protests about not needing help. The third grade team had become her surrogate family over the years, and now they closed ranks around her with a warmth that contrasted sharply with David's cold abandonment. During lunch breaks, they would share stories of their own divorces, their struggles as single women, and their eventual triumphs over circumstances that had initially seemed insurmountable. "You're going to discover parts of yourself you never knew existed," Sarah told her one afternoon. "I know that sounds impossible right now, but trust me, there's life after this kind of betrayal, and sometimes it's better than what came before." As the weeks passed, Rebecca began to notice small changes in her daily routine that surprised her. With their unexpected pleasures, she could eat dinner at whatever time she chose, watch romantic comedies without David's eye-rolling commentary, and spend Saturday mornings reading novels in bed without feeling guilty about being unproductive. The house felt empty, but it also felt peaceful in a way she hadn't experienced in years. She began to remember the woman she had been before marriage, the girl who had loved art history and dreamed of traveling to European museums, who had written poetry in college and believed she might someday publish a book of her own verses. You know, my beautiful viewers, I want to pause here for just a moment because I can feel some of you might be going through something similar right now. Maybe you're dealing with betrayal, or feeling lost, or wondering if your best days are behind you. I want you to know that you're not alone in this journey. Please take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us how you're feeling, what gives you hope, or even what questions you have about starting over. This community we're building together is so special, and your stories matter to all of us who are here. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do, not just for me, but for everyone else who finds comfort and inspiration in these stories of resilience and transformation. The revelation about David's secret life came not through detective work or confrontation, but through the mundane accident of a misdirected phone call on a Thursday evening in late October. Rebecca was preparing a simple dinner of pasta and salad, finding comfort in the rhythmic motions of chopping vegetables, when her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was bright and cheerful, obviously excited about whatever news she was about to share. "David, honey, I just got the test results back from Dr. Morrison, and everything looks perfect. The baby is healthy, and we're right on track for the March due date. I can't wait to tell you in person tonight." The line went silent, as both women realized the mistake simultaneously. Rebecca's hands began to shake so violently that she nearly dropped the phone, while the woman on the other end began stammering apologies and explanations that only made the situation worse. The woman's name was Amanda. She was 29 years old, and she worked as a marketing coordinator at a company that frequently collaborated with David's accounting firm. They had been seeing each other for over a year, and she was 4 months pregnant with his child. The phone call that was meant to share joyful news had instead delivered the most devastating blow Rebecca could have imagined. The man who had spent years telling her they were too old to start over, who had convinced her that their childless marriage was complete and fulfilling, was now preparing to become a father with a woman nearly 20 years younger. The cruelty of timing felt like a cosmic joke at Rebecca's expense. After hanging up the phone, Rebecca sank to the kitchen floor and wept with a grief that seemed to come from the deepest parts of her soul. This wasn't just about losing her husband anymore. It was about losing the future she thought they would share, about confronting the reality that David had been lying to her for months while she worried about their marriage and blamed herself for his distance. The baby he was having with Amanda represented everything Rebecca had wanted and been denied. Everything David had claimed was no longer important to their happiness. She felt foolish for believing him, for trusting him, for wasting years of her life with someone who could so easily replace her with a younger, more fertile version. Jennifer arrived within 20 minutes of Rebecca's tearful phone call, finding her sister still sitting on the kitchen floor, surrounded by scattered vegetables and the detritus of a dinner that would never be eaten. Together, they called Rebecca's lawyer and scheduled an emergency meeting for the following morning. The pregnancy changed everything from a legal standpoint, creating complications around spousal support and David's financial obligations that would extend far beyond their divorce settlement. Rebecca's lawyer, a sharp woman named Patricia Chen, had handled dozens of similar cases and spoke with the clinical precision of someone who understood that emotion had no place in divorce proceedings. "I need you to understand that David's situation with this other woman actually works in our favor," she explained. "His resources will be stretched between supporting you and supporting his new family. We can use that to negotiate a better settlement." But Rebecca found herself less interested in revenge than in understanding how she had missed so many obvious signs of David's deception. Looking back, she could see the evidence clearly. The new cologne, the unexplained absences, the way he had started talking about fresh starts and new chapters without ever explaining what he meant. She had attributed these changes to a midlife crisis or work stress, never imagining that he was systematically planning his exit from their marriage while building a new life with someone else. The depth of his betrayal was staggering, made worse by the realization that she had been an unwitting participant in her own deception. As November arrived with its gray skies and bare trees, Rebecca made a decision that surprised even herself. She would not let David's betrayal define the rest of her life. The house sold quickly in the competitive market, and instead of looking for a small apartment as she had initially planned, Rebecca used her portion of the proceeds as a down payment on a charming 2-bedroom cottage in nearby Evanston. The house was built in 1925 and needed considerable updating, but it had beautiful original hardwood floors, a fireplace that actually worked, and a small garden where she could plant roses come spring. For the first time in months, Rebecca felt a flicker of excitement about the future. The cottage became her sanctuary and her project, a place where she could channel her grief into something constructive and beautiful. She spent her weekends stripping old wallpaper, painting walls in colors David would have considered too bold, and shopping for furniture that reflected her personal taste rather than the neutral compromise style they had maintained throughout their marriage. She discovered she had a natural eye for design and color, often standing in the paint section of Home Depot for hours, comparing subtle differences between shades of blue or green until she found exactly the right tone for each room. The process of creating a home that was entirely her own felt like reclaiming parts of herself that had been dormant for decades. Her students noticed the change in her energy almost immediately. Rebecca had always been a beloved teacher, but now there was something different about her. Presence in the classroom, a vibrancy and authenticity that hadn't been there before. She laughed more easily, took creative risks with her lesson plans, and seemed more present with her students in ways that made them feel truly seen and heard. During parent conferences, several mothers commented on the positive changes they had noticed in their children since the school year began, crediting Rebecca's renewed enthusiasm for making learning feel joyful and exciting again. Winter arrived early. That year, blanketing Rebecca's new neighborhood in snow by mid-December and transforming her cottage into something from a greeting card. She had never lived alone before, having moved from her childhood home directly into the apartment she shared with David after their wedding, and the experience of solitude was both frightening and liberating. Some evenings, the silence felt oppressive, making her acutely aware of every creak and settling sound the old house made. But other nights, she would light a fire in the fireplace, pour herself a glass of wine, and lose herself in books she had been meaning to read for years, feeling a profound sense of contentment that had been absent from her life for longer than she cared to admit. The holidays proved to be the most challenging test of her newfound independence. Thanksgiving had always been a production in their marriage, with Rebecca spending days preparing elaborate meals for David's family members who barely acknowledged her efforts. This year, she accepted Jennifer's invitation to join her family in Springfield, driving down with a sense of relief at not having to orchestrate the complex logistics of hosting. But Christmas was different. Christmas had always been their special time together, and the approaching holiday felt like navigating a minefield of painful memories. Rebecca found herself dreading the season that had once brought her so much joy, uncertain how to create new traditions that didn't feel like pale imitations of her former life. It was Sarah from school who suggested Rebecca join her family for Christmas Eve dinner, explaining that her own mother had died the previous year, and the holiday felt incomplete without someone to mother and fuss over. Sarah's family lived in a boisterous household filled with teenagers, grandparents, and a revolving door of neighbors and friends who treated holidays like community celebrations rather than exclusive family affairs. Rebecca hesitated, feeling like she would be intruding on their intimate traditions, but Sarah insisted with the kind of fierce warmth that made her such an effective teacher. "You're not intruding. You're joining," she said firmly. "There's a difference, and we need you there as much as you need us." Christmas Eve at Sarah's house was a revelation for Rebecca, showing her how holidays could be joyful and inclusive rather than stressful and performative. The house buzzed with activity as multiple generations worked together, preparing food, decorating cookies, and sharing stories that had been told so many times they had become family mythology. Rebecca found herself helping Sarah's mother-in-law roll out pie crust, listening to stories about Sarah's childhood, and feeling more genuinely welcome than she had in years of formal holiday gatherings with David's distant relatives. When Sarah's teenage daughter asked Rebecca about her own Christmas traditions, she realized with a shock that she couldn't remember having any traditions that were truly her own. Everything had been adapted or inherited from David's family expectations. The new year brought unexpected opportunities that seemed to emerge from Rebecca's growing confidence in her ability to navigate life independently. The principal at her school approached her about leading a curriculum development project that would involve collaborating with teachers from other districts and presenting their findings at educational conferences. It was exactly the kind of professional challenge Rebecca had always wanted to pursue. But David had consistently discouraged her from taking on additional responsibilities that might interfere with her availability to support his career. Now, with no one to consult or seek permission from, Rebecca accepted the position immediately, feeling a thrill of excitement about the intellectual stimulation and professional growth it would provide. Working on the curriculum project introduced Rebecca to educators from across the region, many of whom became not just colleagues, but genuine friends who shared her passion for innovative teaching methods. She found herself attending weekend workshops and conferences, staying late after meetings to continue conversations about child development and educational theory, and discovering aspects of her professional identity that had been suppressed during her marriage. Her contributions to the project were recognized and praised by administrators who began talking about leadership opportunities and advancement possibilities that Rebecca had never considered within her reach. As winter slowly gave way to spring, Rebecca began planning her garden with the same methodical attention she brought to her lesson plans. She ordered seed catalogs, researched which plants would thrive in her soil conditions, and designed layouts that would provide color and interest throughout the growing season. The physical act of preparing soil, planting seeds, and nurturing growth felt deeply symbolic of the transformation taking place in her own life. Each morning before school, she would walk through her garden with her coffee, checking for signs of new growth and marveling at the way dormant plants could suddenly burst into life when conditions were right. The cottage itself continued to evolve under Rebecca's careful attention, with each room reflecting more of her personal aesthetic and less of the generic compromise style that had characterized the home she shared with David. She painted the bedroom a soft sage green that reminded her of early spring mornings, hung artwork that spoke to her personally rather than matching predetermined color schemes, and arranged furniture in ways that maximized natural light and created cozy reading nooks. Friends who visited commented on how much the space reflected Rebecca's personality, and she realized they were seeing aspects of her character that had been hidden even from herself during her marriage. By late spring, Rebecca had settled into a rhythm of life that felt both familiar and completely new. Her days were structured around her teaching schedule and the seasonal demands of her garden. But within that framework, she had discovered a freedom of choice that she had forgotten existed. She could decide to paint her bathroom on a whim, could spend Saturday afternoon exploring antique shops without checking anyone else's schedule, could invite friends over for dinner without worrying about whether the menu would meet someone else's standards. The accumulation of these small freedoms created a sense of personal agency that transformed her relationship with her own life from passive acceptance to active participation. The curriculum project concluded with a presentation at the Regional Education Conference in May, where Rebecca found herself standing before an auditorium of 200 educators, sharing innovative teaching strategies that her team had developed over months of collaborative work. Public speaking had always terrified her, but as she looked out at the engaged faces in the audience, she felt a surge of confidence that seemed to come from some previously untapped source of strength. Her presentation was well received, generating questions and compliments that made her realize she had expertise and insights that were valuable to her professional community. Several superintendents from other districts approached her afterward, discussing consulting opportunities and leadership positions that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. The success of the conference presentation led to an unexpected invitation to serve on the state curriculum committee, a prestigious appointment that would involve traveling to the capital city monthly and contributing to educational policy decisions that would impact thousands of students. Rebecca's principal enthusiastically supported her application, explaining that having a teacher from their district serve on such an important committee would bring recognition and resources to their entire school system. As Rebecca completed the application materials, she marveled at how much her professional life had expanded since her divorce, wondering if David's controlling influence had been limiting her potential in ways she had never fully understood. Summer break arrived with a sense of anticipation that Rebecca hadn't felt in years. Instead of the routine vacation planning that had characterized previous summers, destinations chosen by David, activities organized around his preferences, she found herself with complete freedom to design her own schedule. She enrolled in a watercolor painting class at the local community college, something she had wanted to try since high school, but had never pursued because David considered artistic hobbies frivolous and impractical. The class met 3 mornings a week in a sunny studio overlooking Lake Michigan, and Rebecca discovered that she had a natural affinity for capturing light and shadow on paper. Her fellow students in the art class represented a diverse group of adults who had chosen to pursue creative interests at various stages of their lives. There was Margaret, a retired nurse who painted delicate botanical studies, Robert, a widower who found solace in landscape painting, and Elena, a young mother who attended class during her children's summer camp hours. The group developed a camaraderie built around shared struggles with brush techniques and color mixing, but also around the deeper satisfaction of creating something beautiful with their own hands. Rebecca found herself looking forward to these sessions with an enthusiasm that reminded her of childhood art classes, when the possibility of making something wonderful seemed limitless and exciting. The painting class led to other creative pursuits that Rebecca had abandoned or never explored during her marriage. She joined a book club that met monthly at the local library, discovering authors and genres that David had dismissed as lightweight or unworthy of serious attention. She started attending evening lectures at the art museum, learning about movements and techniques that enhanced her appreciation for both classical and contemporary works. These activities connected her with people who shared her interests and curiosity, creating a social network that felt more authentic and engaging than the couple-based relationships that had dominated her married life. As summer progressed, Rebecca's garden reached its full glory, with roses climbing the trellis she had installed, herbs flourishing in the sunny patch near her kitchen window, and perennials providing the kind of reliable beauty that comes from patient cultivation. Neighbors began stopping to compliment her gardening efforts, and several asked for advice about their own landscaping challenges. Rebecca realized she had developed genuine expertise through months of research, experimentation, and careful attention to her plants' needs. The parallels between nurturing a garden and rebuilding her life were not lost on her. Both required patience, faith in future growth, and the courage to try new approaches when established methods weren't working. My wonderful friends, I want to take just a moment here to acknowledge something beautiful that's happening. Rebecca's story reminds us that sometimes we don't know what we're truly capable of until circumstances force us to discover our own strength. If you're watching this and feeling stuck, or if someone you love is going through a difficult transition, please know that growth is possible at any stage of life. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Tell us about a time when you surprised yourself with your own resilience, or share what dreams you're nurturing right now. Your stories inspire not just me, but everyone in this incredible community we're building together. And if you're finding hope and encouragement in these stories, please subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss the amazing journeys we share here. August brought unexpected news that would test Rebecca's newfound confidence in ways she couldn't have anticipated. She was deadheading roses in her front garden when a familiar car pulled into her driveway, and she looked up to see David walking toward her with the hesitant posture of someone approaching a potentially dangerous animal. He looked older than she remembered, with gray, threading through his hair and lines around his eyes that hadn't been there during their marriage. More striking than his physical changes was the absence of the confident arrogance that had once characterized his every movement. He stood at the edge of her garden, clearly unsure whether he was welcome on her property, and asked quietly if they could talk. Rebecca's first instinct was to refuse, to protect the peace she had worked so hard to build from the person who had destroyed it so carelessly. But curiosity won over caution, and she led him to the small patio behind her cottage, where they sat across from each other at the wrought iron table she had purchased for evening meals al fresco. David looked around at her garden, her cozy outdoor space, and the cottage itself, with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You've done something beautiful here, Becca," he said, using the nickname he had abandoned years before their separation. "It looks like you." The comment surprised her with its accuracy. This space did reflect her personality in ways their former home never had, despite her 23 years of living there. What David had come to tell her was both shocking and strangely predictable. His relationship with Amanda was falling apart under the pressure of new parenthood, financial stress, and the growing realization that they had very little in common beyond their initial physical attraction. The baby, a daughter named Emma, was colicky and demanding, requiring constant attention that left both parents exhausted and irritable. Amanda's maternity leave had been unpaid, creating financial strain that David hadn't anticipated, and their small apartment felt cramped and chaotic in ways that made him nostalgic for the organized comfort of his former life. The romance that had seemed so exciting when it was forbidden and secretive had become mundane and overwhelming when faced with the practical realities of daily existence. "I made the biggest mistake of my life when I left you," David said, his voice thick with emotion Rebecca had rarely heard during their marriage. "I thought I wanted something different, something more exciting, but what I really wanted was to feel young again. I convinced myself that our marriage was boring, that we had grown apart, but the truth is that I was just scared of getting older, and I blamed you for reminding me that time was passing." His confession was both validating and infuriating, confirming suspicions Rebecca had harbored, but providing explanations that came far too late to matter. She found herself feeling sorry for Amanda, trapped in a relationship with a man who was clearly comparing her to the wife he had discarded. David's proposal was exactly what Rebecca might have expected 18 months earlier. He wanted to come home, to rebuild their marriage, to return to the comfortable life they had shared before his midlife crisis destroyed everything they had built. Together, he had learned his lesson, he insisted, and now understood the value of what he had thrown away. The younger woman, the excitement of new romance, the fantasy of starting over, all of it had proven to be illusions that couldn't sustain the weight of real life. Rebecca was his true partner, the person who knew him better than anyone else, and he wanted to spend the rest of his life making up for the pain he had caused her. Listening to David's rehearsed speech, Rebecca felt a curious combination of emotions. There was satisfaction in hearing him admit his mistakes, validation in his recognition of her worth, and even a small flame of the old love that had once defined her world. But stronger than any of these feelings was a profound sense of disconnect from the woman who would have been grateful for this apology, who would have welcomed him back without question, who would have sacrificed her newfound independence for the security of familiar companionship. That woman had existed 18 months ago, but she no longer lived in this cottage, tended this garden, or taught with this confidence. "David," Rebecca said carefully, choosing her words with the precision of someone who understood their importance, "I appreciate you coming here to apologize. I needed to hear you acknowledge the pain you caused, and I'm grateful that you've recognized the value of what we had together. But the woman you left, the woman who begged you to work on our marriage and blamed herself for your unhappiness, she doesn't live here anymore. The person I am now wouldn't be satisfied with the life we had before, even if we could somehow recreate it." She saw him flinch at her words, clearly unprepared for the possibility that his apology might not be enough to repair what he had broken. David spent over an hour trying to convince Rebecca that they could build something better than what they'd had before, that his experience with Amanda had taught him to appreciate her in ways he had previously taken for granted. He promised counseling, renewed commitment, and the kind of attention to her needs that had been absent from their marriage for years. But with each argument he made, Rebecca became more certain that returning to him would be a betrayal of the woman she had become during their separation. She had discovered parts of herself that only emerged in solitude, had built a life that reflected her authentic interests and values, and had learned to make decisions based on her own judgment rather than someone else's expectations. "You know," Jennifer said, joining Rebecca at the kitchen island where she was arranging vegetables from her garden into a colorful salad, "I have to admit something. When David first left, I was terrified for you. Not just because of the practical stuff, the finances and the house and all that, but because you'd been married to him for so long that I wasn't sure you'd remember who you were without him defining it for you." Jennifer's voice carried the weight of sisterly concern that had kept her awake countless nights during those first devastating months. Watching Rebecca navigate the wreckage of her 23-year marriage with a bewildered expression that broke Jennifer's heart. She remembered finding Rebecca sitting motionless at this very counter, staring at divorce papers with the same blank confusion of someone trying to read a foreign language, her hands trembling as she traced the legal terminology that would formally dissolve the life she'd built with such careful dedication. Rebecca paused in her chopping, her knife hovering over a particularly vibrant red bell pepper as she considered her sister's words. The late afternoon sunlight streaming through the kitchen window caught the silver threads in her hair, threads she no longer felt compelled to hide with expensive salon treatments that David had once insisted made her look more professional for his business functions. Those monthly appointments had felt like armor then, each highlight and trim a small act of maintenance designed to keep her worthy of standing beside him at corporate events and dinner parties. "I'm not sure I knew who I was either," she admitted, her voice steady but tinged with the vulnerability that came from honest self-reflection. "I think that was part of what made his leaving so devastating initially. It wasn't just losing the relationship, it was realizing how completely I disappeared into being his wife that I'd forgotten I was supposed to be a whole person on my own. For decades, I measured my worth by how seamlessly I could anticipate his needs, how perfectly I could orchestrate our social calendar, how skillfully I could smooth over his rough edges in public. I became this elaborate performance of wifehood, and when he walked away, I was left wondering what, if anything, existed underneath all that careful construction. But look at you now," Jennifer continued, gesturing around. The warm, inviting kitchen, with its herbs growing on the windowsill and Rebecca's own artwork adorning the walls. Watercolor landscapes that captured the changing seasons in her backyard with an intimacy and attention to detail that spoke of countless hours spent in quiet observation. The kitchen itself had been transformed from the sterile, magazine-perfect space David had preferred into something that breathed with life and personality. Mismatched pottery held fresh flowers, cookbooks lay open to well-used recipes, and the counters bore the gentle chaos of someone who actually lived and created in this space, rather than merely maintaining it as a showpiece. You didn't just survive his abandonment, you used it as an opportunity to become someone more interesting than you ever were when you were married to him. And the best part is, you genuinely seem to like this person you've become. The observation struck Rebecca as profoundly accurate. She did like herself now in a way that felt unprecedented in her adult life. During her marriage, self-approval had always been contingent on David's satisfaction with her performance as a wife, on maintaining harmony in their household, on successfully managing all the details that kept their life running smoothly. Now, her sense of self-worth came from sources that belonged entirely to her. The satisfaction of engaging her students effectively, the meditative pleasure of working in her garden, the creative fulfillment of translating her observations into watercolor paintings, and the deep contentment of living authentically rather than performatively. This internal validation felt more solid and sustainable than any external approval she had previously sought. She found herself making choices based on what brought her genuine joy rather than what maintained peace or projected the right image, and the freedom of that shift had been nothing short of revelatory. Even the way she dressed now reflected this transformation, comfortable fabrics and colors she actually loved, jewelry chosen for its personal significance rather than its appropriateness for her husband's professional image.